Russia appears to be reorganizing its forces in the wake of Ukraine's incursion. U.S. officials tell the Wall Street Journal that Russia is withdrawing troops from Ukraine to respond to the counterassault. The officials did not specify how many troops have been moved, but it points to the effectiveness of Ukraine's gamble. The country's military commander said yesterday his forces had taken control of 74 Russian towns and villages since the incursion was first launched last week.
Let's bring in right now former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is a chief international analyst for NBC News. Admiral, thanks so much for being with us. I want to read a paragraph from the New York Times this morning, column this morning, article this morning. Mostly on the defensive since a failed counteroffensive last year, Ukraine has pushed 7 miles into Russia along a 25-mile front, taken dozens of Russian soldiers as prisoners, analysts and Russian officials say. The governor of Russia's Kursk region said on Monday Ukraine controls 28 towns and villages there. More than 132,000 people have been evacuated from nearby areas, Russian officials said. And it seems that in this offensive, Ukraine has taken more ground in Russia than Russia has taken in Ukraine all year. Talk about this incursion and the strategic importance and really the strategic necessity of it for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the right word. And let's kind of do it from the inside out. So what's the impact in Russia and on the Russian armed forces? It's a morale blow to the Russian people who have been fed endless propaganda and lies that this is going to be a cakewalk when the war started. And suddenly we're up to hundreds of thousands of dead Russians. And now Russia is invaded for the first time since the Second World War, Joe. I mean, this is 85 years ago, and this shatters all of that. That's a big deal. Secondly, to the Russian piece of this, as you correctly point out, now they're forced to swing forces away from their main battle effort down south of where this military salient has occurred. Russia's got to deal with that. They got to shift forces. Extremely disconcerting militarily. That's kind of the Russia piece. Over here in Ukraine and Kyiv, big shot in the arm. Morale has been sort of fluttery for the last year, frankly. This is a good boost to that. And third and finally, think about how this lands internationally. People talking about it. European airwaves are flooded with this. This is a big boost to the efforts to continue military aid to the Ukrainians. So those three audiences are all kind of 2 thumbs up, and we all should be this morning.
Admiral, good morning. Ukraine's top military commander says they've taken 74 Russian towns and villages of varying sizes, but 74 is not an insignificant number. So if we pull back a little bit, this is one moment in time in a long war. What is the larger significance? What does it say about where Ukraine is and about where Russia is in the war?
2 big things. One that you're seeing, Willie, is the use of what we call combined arms. That's military speak for putting together air, artillery, armor, ground soldiers, cyber, drones, putting it all together. This is exactly what the West has been training the Ukrainians to do for over 2.5 years, and you're seeing a real proof of case in doing this. That is very disconcerting to the Russians. And then secondly, it's not just what's happening on the battlefield here, because this is not going to turn into a march on Moscow, Napoleon in the 1800s burning the city of Moscow. That's not in the cards. But it's not just the battlefield, it's the negotiating table. If Zelensky can hold on to a chunk of this, that becomes a pretty significant bargaining trip. Final thought, several thousand Russian soldiers will end up being captured as a result of this over time. Those become bargaining chips to play back for Ukrainians that are captured, and also looking ahead to that negotiating table.
Admiral, that last usage of words that you just appropriated, if they can hold on to the territory they've seized in Russia right now, 74 villages and towns, The Russian army, in terms of personnel, is much, much larger than the Ukrainian army. The military incompetence level of the Russian high command is notoriously incompetent. And I don't mean to throw cold water on any progress that's being made by the Ukrainian army. But if you look at the map and you look at the direction of the attack of the Ukrainian army within Russia, they could be easily outflanked. Does this bother you at all?
It does. And anytime you create a kind of, again, to use a military word, a salient, where you've taken, if you will, a peninsula of territory, you're now pretty vulnerable on both sides of that. But, Mike, it cuts both ways. The Ukrainians can then come out of that salient and cut behind the Russian forces where their soft underbelly of logistics, command and control exists. That's why Putin's generals have got to move very quickly to shore this thing up. Bottom line, will they hold on to this territory? I think that's unlikely. I think more of what's happening is that demonstration of military capability, morale busting in Russia, morale enhancing in Ukraine. That's the objective. They may well take those prisoners, come back, and let Putin imagine where the next attack could come from.
So, Joe, the most striking thing to me about all this is silence. And that's silence from the United States. No objections raised. And that's very different than what the Biden White House and Biden administration's approach has been throughout. As they kept trying to tamp down Ukraine, try to warn off Ukraine from striking within Russia, giving very slow approval to using some of these long-range missiles, finally striking along border towns. On this one, Ukraine, per the officials I've spoken to, did not give the U.S. a heads up. They just went in. The United States has not objected. Neither has its European allies. And officials I've talked to say this does suggest perhaps a little bit of a sea change. The United States being a little more willing for Ukraine to take these risks and to take the fight into Russia, shattering Putin's claim to his own citizens that this war effort wouldn't impact their lives.
Well, and once again, it shows how well Joe Biden has worked this from the very beginning of the war. I mean, you've had people on the far right, basically, well, on the far left saying we should just, and J.D. Vance and Donald Trump basically saying we should just turn Ukraine over to Putin. And then you have people on the far right basically saying we need to go, sing Marching to Zion and storm Moscow. It doesn't work that way. When you're dealing with a country that has more nuclear weapons than anybody else and has threatened to use it. There has been a measured, ordered approach, week after week, month after month, year after year. And this is where we are now. And it is working. And not only have the Ukrainians stayed in the fight because of the United States and our allies in Europe and across the world, but also because of Joe Biden's measured approach. And what are we seeing here? Not the beginning of the end, but as I quoted Churchill yesterday, I'll say it again, maybe the end of the beginning. And maybe a move that actually encourages Vladimir Putin and his people to be more serious in their talks with Bill Burns the next time they have that opportunity and start putting together a plan for peace. And Admiral Stavridis, I'm going to talk to you about two other things. Feel free to comment on that if you'd like. But while we're talking about peace, I was struck by something I read, a paragraph in David Ignatius's latest column about what's going on in Gaza and how there is pressure from all sides for a ceasefire, for a hostage deal, for peace, except in one corner. And let me read this to you. And sadly, it's not surprising as Israel and Iran move closer to a regional war. Joe Biden, joined by the leaders of Egypt and Qatar, have been mediating partners. The best outcome for this crisis for both countries, prodded by the international community, would be to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza and release Israeli hostages. Now, listen to this, Admiral. The peace plan is backed by the UN Security Council, the Group of Seven, moderate Arab countries, Israel's defense and security establishment, and Hamas has dropped its main objection. And David goes on to say the only holdout is Benjamin Netanyahu, and I'm sorry it needs to be said, the man that we have been talking about for months and others have been talking about for months, who would continue this war, continue to up the ante, because he now alone, if you look, even his war cabinet and his defense ministers that think that his, quote, total victory in Gaza, even his own defense minister says that's just unrealistic. So are we really in a position where one man who's trying to avoid political defeat and jail is going to move us into a regional war?
Unfortunately, you can lay that case out pretty coherently that he is the roadblock here. And I know well, for example, General Benny Gantz, who was the number 2 in the war cabinet, is, in my view, the probable next prime minister of Israel. He finally walked out of the war cabinet. Yoav Gallant, another former defense minister, another former general I know well, who is the current defense minister, is the one who is publicly throwing the red flag on Benjamin Netanyahu's unconditional surrender of Hamas.
By the way, his own defense minister. So before people start shouting, "You're doing the bidding of Hamas," which of course nobody is here. This is his own defense minister, the security establishment, all saying this is unrealistic, and we need to avoid a regional war. We need to make peace now, or at least a ceasefire, right?
100% correct. Picture a scenario where publicly Lloyd Austin is breaking out and saying that Joe Biden's approach to China and our defenses in the South China Sea are all wrong. It's impossible to imagine that, and yet it's unfolding in front of our eyes here. And by the way, Yoav Gallant is not on the left in Israeli politics. So this is something that is finally starting to build around Netanyahu. I am hopeful of that. And your point, Joe, that all of this will put pressure that hopefully can help us at the negotiating table is crucial. Hey, final thought back to Ukraine for 1 second. Something you said, I just want to draw a line under it. Yes, Team Biden has handled this well. You know who else has? The Europeans, our allies.
Yes, they have
put more money into this than we have. They are more faithful to this, and they led the way on taking the shackles off the Ukrainians, letting them use long-range UK missiles, French missiles. So above all, for me, as a former NATO commander, I look at what's happening in Ukraine through the prism of allied operations pretty good. And frankly, that ought to worry us when we talk about Team Trump coming in here, who is so skeptical of our alliance systems.
Exactly. Finally, I want to turn your attention to, and I'm sure you saw this, a piece by Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, and I'll quote the headline: "The Navy is breaking down. We need our allies to help fix our ships." I'm curious, do you agree that our Navy is breaking down and we need help?
Yes and yes. And the things that His Honor, the former mayor, who's a good friend of mine, he so correctly underlines the challenges are in the defense industrial base, building the ships, the maintenance. What's not breaking down is the morale of our sailors who are under fire in the Arabian Gulf, under fire in the Indian Ocean from these Houthi rebels, knocking down missiles, launching strikes, 2 aircraft carriers now in the region, a guided missile submarine. Our Navy forward is doing just fine, and I know the ambassador would agree with me on that, Ambassador Emanuel. He is correct. It's the maintenance, the shipbuilding, the ship numbers, those are things we've got to fix. And again, we've talked a lot about allies this morning. Japan, in this regard, doubling their defense budget, one of the great shipbuilding nations, ship repair. I've had ships under my command repaired there. It's quite remarkable. I am 2 thumbs up for Rahm Emanuel.
Retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis, thank you as always for coming on this morning. And